Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the English class. I, once again, will be your teacher, Luke, and today we'll be learning about the next part of Foundation 1, which is sentences and their structures. Now, in the last class, we learned previously about vocabulary and how words are able to convey meaning. But now we'll be learning how to mix those and combine those words together to be able to communicate more effectively through sentences. So let's begin. What is a sentence itself? A sentence can be defined as a set of words which convey meaning together. So, if we know that words are the smallest way that someone can convey meaning, a set of words can be combined to create a sentence, a way of expressing those words in a more clear way. Now, sentences come in many different shapes and forms, such as what is a sentence being a question, and a set of words which convey meaning being a regular sentence. However, over here, we'll be talking about just a regular sentence without any punctuation. So we'll only be using a period. Punctuation will be covered in the classes going forward after this. But for now, we'll be focusing on the basic sentence and how a sentence is formed. Now, inside of a sentence, there are five main things that you can find in it, being a subject, a verb, an object, an adjective, and an adverb. Now, these are all individual parts of a sentence that can or cannot be excluded from one, which we'll get into later on. However, we'll go first into explaining what each of these are instead of talking about how to use them. That'll be at the very end in talking about sentence patterns. But for now, let's go first into the subject and what it's used for. Now, the subject of the sentence is usually what the sentence is trying to describe, what the other words are trying to explain. So let's take a look at the example. I walk to school. In this sentence, what we're trying to describe is someone walking to school, right? And with I being placed at the very start, we can know that the subject is I, as now the sentence is describing who walked to school. I walk to school. I, being I, am walking to school. That is what the sentence is describing, and thus I am the subject. Now, moving on is the verb. The verb is the word which describes the action the subject is doing. So, going back to the previous example, I walk to school. The verb is walked, as now we're trying to describe what is I doing? What am I doing? And then for that, we need to use a verb, which is walked. So I walk to school. So now we know that I is walking, right? Next is the object, which is the word which describes the action is being done to. So if we look back at the previous example again, I walk to school. The object is school because we're essentially, it's trying to describe where am I walking to. I walked. So what is the verb being done to? So in that sentence, I walked. Where am I walking? To school, right? Let's take a look at the second example. I wrote in my book. If we break it back down again, I is the subject in this case. So we know that I is doing something. Wrote is the verb in this case, writing down something. So we know that I am writing down something. But what am I writing down and what am I writing to? Right? So that is what is the object. So I wrote in my book. Now we know that I am writing something in my book. You can obviously say that I wrote as a sort of way to describe what you're doing, but that isn't a complete sentence because what it does is it only describes what action you're doing, not what you're specifically doing about it. What is it headed towards, right? So let's go to the third example, which also has the same structure again. So if we talk about Timothy ate my lunch, we know that the subject here is Timothy, and the action he's doing is ate, right? So is eating. If we say Timothy ate, that's not very clear. What is Timothy eating, right? That's not a full sentence. If we add the object being my lunch, we can now find a complete sentence being Timothy ate my lunch. Okay, moving on, we have adjectives, which is a descriptor word, the word which describes the object or subject. Notice how there are two possible placements in a basic sentence structure. Now, keep in mind that this applies to basically any placement. So if the object or subject, even if their places are all over the place and they're switched around, you can still add an adjective to it no matter what. So let's take a look at the example. I walked to the big school. Now, this is an expansion of what we had before, being I walked to the school. So we know that I is the subject, we know that walked is the verb, and we know that school is the object, right? Now, if we want to add an adjective, being big, you have to place it before the subject or object. In this case, we put it on the object, right? So we're trying to describe the object even further. So I walked to the big school. The adjective becomes big because we're trying to describe the school. Now, if we were to try to describe or elaborate on what the subject is, we would put it we would put the adjective next to the subject, right? So let's take a look at the second sentence. My fast cat chased the mouse. Now we know that using the adjective of fast, we know that the cat is chasing a mouse, but now we know that the cat is also very fast. The fast cat is chasing the mouse. This could technically also work if you move fast to the mouse. So now we know that a cat is chasing a very fast mouse. That is essentially what an adjective is used for, to describe objects or subjects even further within a sentence, to describe them even more. So we understand the picture a bit more, because if we don't add big to the very first sentence, we wouldn't know what size the school was. And if it's trying to convey a point, well, we now know that's a big school. If in the second sentence we didn't add fast, we wouldn't know which one was faster, the cat or the mouse. We still don't know, but we wouldn't know how fast the cat was, or we wouldn't know how fast the mouse was. What it's trying to do is basically elaborate further so we understand more in the sentence. Now, we'll move on to finally the adverb, which is a short version of adjective and verb combined, right? So in short, this is the word that describes the verb itself. So let's take a look at the example again. So you have I walked to school, right? Then we added today at the very end, the adverb being today. What that does is it allows us to elaborate on the action itself. So if we just said I walked to school, that's not very clear, right? But if we said I walked to school today, we can understand that that the subject I is walking today, right? So you can see where the difference is, because this is describing the verb itself, right? Let's take a look at the second example, which has two adverbs itself. So this is one of the more common ones, which is being descriptors of how likely or how often something happens, and the time something happens, which is usually allocated to the adverb itself. So let's look at this. I always drink water in the morning. So obviously, you could shorten this to become I drink water, right? But by adding adverbs to describe the action of drinking water, we can add more to the sentence, right? So adding always at the very start allows us to understand that, oh yeah, he drinks water very often, right? Almost always, in fact. And then in the morning allows us to understand that this action happens every single morning. It's describing the action, and that's why it's an adverb. Okay. Now, moving on, let's look at this example over here. Justin always writes math notes on his iPad. Try to break it down and figure out what is the subject, what is the object, what is the verb, and what is the adverb based on what we've learned previously. Okay, you have something in your head? All right, let's go into what is the actual answer. So the one I've marked in yellow is the quote unquote the subject itself. So over here, we know that Justin is a subject. Green and blue are adverbs because they are describing the action. Pink is the verb itself, and red is the object. So we understand that Justin is writing his math notes, right? But when and what, that is elaborated on by the adverbs. So we know that Justin always writes math notes. So that means he's always writing the math notes, but on where specifically, we can elaborate more on his iPad. So this allows us to understand not only what is Justin doing, but when he does it, but also where he does it. That is the purpose of all of these adjectives and adverbs and such. It's just to create a clear sentence that can convey as much meaning as possible. Okay, so this is the next point, which is in regards to sentence structure. Now, as you can see over here, if we switch math notes and Justin together, they technically make sense. Math notes always writes Justin on his iPad. But you know that realistically, that doesn't make sense, which is why the next point is very important, being sentence patterns, right? So if you take a look back at the subject over here, math notes always writes Justin. That doesn't really make sense because we know that Justin is a person, right? And math notes is an object, and it's something you write down. So it doesn't make sense that math notes would be writing Justin, which is why sentence structure and sentence patterns are very important. Because if you switch the subject and object around, for example, that doesn't make the sentence make sense anymore because, yeah, well, it just doesn't make sense logically, right? So this is the quote unquote basic sentence pattern you'll have in English, which is the very, very simple one. So it'll be a subject followed by a verb, followed by an object, adjective, or adverb, depending on what you're trying to say. So let's take a look at the first sentence. I eat lunch. That is a subject, a verb, and an object. Very clear. you know what you are, you know what is being eaten, which is lunch, and you know it's, well, eating something, right? Now, if you were to change it to an adjective instead, you would be trying to describe the subject, right? So I am sick, which would mean that I currently am sick. That's the sort of twisting it, because obviously you can't put I sick as an adjective. You have to describe that I am currently sick. That is why there's a verb in there. And finally, it is subject, verb, and adverb, right? Because what you're doing is trying to describe the adverb itself, the action. So I run fast and is an example of that. You're trying to describe that while I am running, I am also running very fast, correct? So it's very important to keep the subject and object in the right places, especially as well as with the verbs, because otherwise you'd have a sentence like this before, previously on the bottom. Or you could have a sentence like, oh yeah, lunch eats I. That doesn't really make sense either. So sentence pattern is very, very key and crucial to being remembered, right? So we'll move on to, this is more of an example of a realistic pattern. So over here, instead of just having subject and verbs and object, adjective, or verbs, usually people like to describe the subject, describe the object, describe the verb even more, just to make it make more, well, quote unquote, make more sense to people, right? So let's take a look at this sentence. My busy mom likes to eat lunch at the busy restaurant near school. Let's try to break it down in your head, right? I'll give you some time. Okay. You have a vision in your head? Okay. Let's move on to here. So I changed the word busy to popular, but it's the same thing essentially. So again, like before, yellow is used for the subject. Purple is now used for the what's called the adjective. Green is used for the adverb, and pink is used for the verb, and red is used for an object, right? So if we break it down, we know that my mom is the base subject, right? And then we know that, hold up. Okay, wait, can you like rewind this back again? Okay. 3, 1. Okay, let's move on to the breakdown. So if we look at the more realistic sentence, we can see that there is a lot of adjectives added on. So let's just break it down again. So yellow over here is the subject. Green is acting as the adverb. Pink is acting as the verb again. And red is acting as the object. And purple is acting as the adjectives, right? So usually people like to describe the subject first, right? So my mom isn't just my mom anymore. My busy mom is like, it likes to be added, right? Then likes and describes the verb again, because it's trying to describe, oh yeah, she likes to do this often. She likes to be doing it almost always, right? So that's why the verb is being described, right? Then lunch is, well, the object. I like to eat lunch, right? That's very basic. Then you move on to describing the where, the situation. Now, this is regularly an adverb. However, I decided to add on to make this seem more of a more realistic solution is because you can also add adjectives onto here, because restaurant isn't just an adverb. It is also a object in and of itself, right? So you can add adjectives onto that, like I just did over here, at the popular restaurant or at the busy restaurant, like before. So this just goes to show you how complex even this basic sentence structure can be, because keep in mind that this can be switched around the places. However, that placement and switching around will come later on in later classes, but this is just to show you that this can be more realistic and this can be more complex than it really is. So please keep in mind the rules for adjectives and adverbs and how they can be added pretty much to basically anything. But if you'd like to have a simple breakdown, just stick to this as the quote unquote simple pattern, right? Let's take a look at this practice. So write a sentence in this structure using the following words. So you write a sentence in the structure of a subject, verb, adjective, object, and adverb using book, my friend, library, borrowed, from the, and new. Okay, gonna give you some time for a bit. Okay, do you have it in your head? Let's break down the answer, which is here. My friend borrowed a new book from the library. So that is the supposed answer, right? So we know that my friend, okay, this is just a hint for you, but my friend is capitalized, so it will go in front of the sentence, right? So my friend being the subject, Borrowed, this is the only verb in the sentence because it's the only action, so we can automatically place that over there. Borrowed a new book, which is an adjective, which is a new, since it's trying to describe something that's new. And the object being book, right? So a new book that fits the criteria before. And then from the library acts as the adverb, right? So that was the basic example of how you can rearrange words to become a sentence, right? Now, I put a bit over there at the bottom about technically, right? Because technically the sentence "my friend from the library borrowed a new book" also works because from the library can describe where you met a friend, right? So that becomes an adverb in and of itself. Okay. However, as I specifically said that you need to format it in this form, which is subject, verb, adjective, object, and adverb. And so there is no need to describe the friend itself. So this in this question would be wrong. However, as a sentence itself, it still works. So just note what you're trying to describe, because over here, you're trying to describe that a new book came from the library and then your friend borrowed it, right? But over here, you're describing that your friend from the library borrowed a new book. And it doesn't necessarily mean that in the second sentence, the book doesn't necessarily have to come from the library. It can come from someone else. You can elaborate the sentence even more. My friend from the library borrowed a new book from his friend, right? You're basically in here, you're describing that your friend is from the library. Over here, you don't know where your friend came from, right? But over here, you do know that the new book came from the library. But the book over here, the book on the can we go back over here? Okay. 3, 2. Okay, let's break down the answer for this. So looking at the practice, looking at the answer over here, it is my friend borrowed a new book from the library. So if we were to look at the word list over here, my friend automatically acts as the subject because it's the only one capitalized, right? Next, we were looking for a verb, an action. So that would be borrowed, which is the only action on this list. Next, adjective. What is something that helps describe, right? Which is a new. These two words help describe something. And then so let's look at an object, right? What is the object that is potentially being borrowed? It doesn't make sense to borrow a library, so let's borrow a book. And then finally, an adverb. What could describe the verb over here? Oh yeah, we see the words from the, and then obviously you can couple that with the library. So that becomes a sentence of, my friend borrowed a new book from the library. That is the final sentence you were expected to get. Technically speaking, you could get a second sentence for this, which is, my friend from the library borrowed a new book. However, these two describe different things. Over here, I'm asking you specifically to describe where does the object come from by adding an adverb to the object. Over here, in this second sentence, my friend from the library borrowed a new book, you're explaining where you found your friend, where you met your friend. So that would be incorrect with the structure over here. However, this sentence still does work. So just to outline the differences, we have over here, my friend borrowed a new book from the library. We know that we have a friend, but we don't know where we met the friend. It's not explained over here. But what we do know is where the new book came from, which is from the library. In the second sentence, however, my friend from the library borrowed a new book. We know where my friend came from, being from the library. That is the use of the adjective or the adverb, right? Now, however, we don't know where a new book comes from because we use the adverb to describe my friend over here. So over here, we know we have a friend and we borrowed a book from the library, and he borrowed a book from the library. But over here, we know a friend from a library, but we don't know where they borrowed a new book from, just to outline it really simply. That just goes to show you how the placement of words in a sentence can make it very different itself. Okay? And that is it for the presentation today. So if you'd like to have some practice with this, just try to think of words in your head and try to find different ways you can rearrange them and how that changes the meaning. Try to play around with adjectives, try to play around with adverbs and stuff. Those can really help with you understanding more about how sentences are formed. Next class, we'll be delving into the sort of more complex parts about a sentence, being punctuation and such. And I hope to see you back again there. Please try to review this and the vocabulary beforehand so you can understand the next lesson comprehensively. Thank you.